Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's webinar, An Evening in Castlebar Jail with the Women and Men of 1798. I have a slide presentation that I'm proposing to work through in a couple of moments. At the end, there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions, which hopefully I'll be able to answer, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. Before we start with working through the slides, I want to invite all of you to suspend reality for an hour this evening. Now that shouldn't be too difficult, bearing in mind that reality generally has been suspended for almost a year at this stage. So I'm going to take you back in time, and we're going to travel back in time together to a place that's a long way away from coronavirus and lockdowns. We're going to travel back to Wednesday, the 27th of February, 1799. And that date will, the relevance of that date will become apparent as we work through the presentation. So you're standing late in the evening on the green in Castlebar. You're facing the old jail. It's dark, it's wet, it's windy. There are very few people about. There's some lights emanating from some of the nice townhouses around the green. You can hear some voices coming from the new hotel to the left of the jail. To the front of the jail, there are a number of military guards lying against the wall, hiding in corners, sheltering from the rain. As you move towards the jail and into it, you encounter the guard room, and in the guard room, you're likely to meet or encounter a number of men from the Royal Meath Militia, thought to be the regiment responsible for the guarding the jail and supervising prisoners. In their guard room, you'll find a number of candles are lit. There's probably a fire burning. Some arms are left against the wall, ready for use. And somewhere in the room, there is also likely a prisoner or two locked in irons, separated for their own safety from some of the other prisoners locked in the cells. Further in through the prison, in the darkness, there are the many cells, all of which are locked. You can hear men whispering in the cells. You can also hear other noises, the clinking of chains, people moving around, as men work to burrow or dig holes through the walls of the jail to effect an escape into the yard, and then beyond the yard and the wall, the mountains in Navan and Partry and places like that. So on the 27th of August, 1798, a coalition of French and Irish soldiers achieved what really was an unlikely victory at Castlebar. The latter stages of that engagement happened on the green, close to the jail and Christchurch, the cathedral on the green. And a lone Fraser Fencible sought to defend the jail as the rest of the Royalist Protestant militia and yeomanry fled Castlebar. And his defence was unsuccessful, and the French left Castlebar in pursuit of the fleeing English forces. Over the last 200 years, the Battle of Castlebar has been celebrated many times, and rightfully so. There have also been accounts of the battle written in textbooks, articles, and journals. And 2 or 3 years ago, when I went in search of the men who were in Castlebar jail during and after the rebellion and the Battle of Castlebar, I found very few of them in the textbooks and in the journals. So then I ventured into the usual places that one goes to do this kind of research, National Archives, etc. And there I found upward on 228 individuals who were in Castlebar jail in the period from approximately September 1798 up to 1801, 1802. In September of last year, I published my account of what I found, details of those who were incarcerated in the jail, also some details around the important role the jail played in the suppression of the rebellion and in the, I suppose, in the years and months that followed the battle at Castlebar. So this image you see in front of you on the screen, it's from the National Library of Ireland. Its title is The Rout of the Redcoats at Castlebar. It's, I think, captures quite nicely all of the fear, the chaos, the anguish, and the terror on the face of the fleeing English military with the French on their heels. I think the image of the children standing in the doorway celebrating as the cannonball and the musket balls pass is a little bit interesting. Quite what street it is, I'm not sure. It's possibly Market Street, now Main Street, although it could also be anywhere from there up to and along Spencer Street. So this map is William Larkin's map of 1808, and it shows central Castlebar. It's not a moment in time because we've added a number of labels to the map to show really what Castlebar looked like in the period, or the centre of Castlebar looked like in the period from, say, 1768, when the infirmary was built, up to 1835, when the old jail, or when the jail became the old jail. That's shown on the left-hand side of the map. A new jail was opened in Castlebar in 1835, and it's not shown on this map. So then around the green, you have, just beside the jail, you've got the hotel I mentioned a few moments ago. Then just opposite that, there are a number of trees, one of which was the hanging tree. You've got the Methodist chapel. And then on the junction with Spencer Street, you have the courthouse shown. That would not have been there in 1798. It was built in 1806. And through the line that goes through the center of the green, sort of pink line with sort of dots either side of it, is the route of a road that was proposed at the time that was never constructed. And what a different place the green would be today if that road had been constructed. So we move forward 100 years or so from the Battle of Castlebar. This is the green. The building where the two gentlemen are standing to the right was the location of the old jail. In the 1870s, the jail had been demolished and a new Bank of Ireland was constructed, and that building is still there today, although it serves a different purpose. And then just along by, to the left of the jail, you have the hotel we mentioned a moment ago, and other buildings that were substantially, I think, reconstructed or recreated in the 19th century. And then in the center of the picture is the Methodist chapel, the hanging tree, the water pump and the bollards with the chain would not have been there, obviously, in 1798. So this is George Cruikshank's illustration of the defense of the jail in 1798, drawn several decades after the actual fact. It does perhaps capture the reality of the event, because the author of the book, William Hamilton Maxwell, in which Cruikshank's illustration appears, borrowed heavily from Musgrave's account of the rebellion and also his account of the assault on the jail. You can see the remains of some French infantrymen along the bottom of the steps. It is said that the Fraser Fencible killed 5 of them before his position was overrun, and his he was bludgeoned to death and his brains strewn out on the steps of the jail. And you can see the infantryman with the butt end of the musket raised in the air, ready to bring it down on the unfortunate Scotsman. So Castlebar Jail on the eve of the Battle of Castlebar. The jail opened in 1788. It was inspected while under construction in 1786 by John Howard. And Howard was a very well-known prison reformer. And he expressed the opinion at the time that the jail was on far too small a scale. And when he said that, I doubt very much if he had in mind the full-scale collapse of civilian authority that was soon to occur, and the inevitable overcrowding of the jail that followed the collapse of the rebellion in Mayo. The jail was a two-story single building structure with a yard enclosed by a wall. How high that wall was, we don't know. There is a wall there today around a yard that looks to be of a similar size. Was it the wall that was there in 1798? Perhaps not. To the front of the jail, there was a Marshalsea or debtors' prison. And I think that, certainly from what I've read, that part of the jail formed part of the area taken over by the military after the rebellion. The jail had a kitchen, common areas or common halls, an infirmary, and the guard room I mentioned earlier. The maximum capacity would have been 90 prisoners. And that figure is taken from an 1818 report, but I think it's probably right because there's no evidence of any expansion or construction in the period between 1788 and 1819. An 1826 report tells us that there were 25 cells in the jail. Now, I think that number was much lower in 1798 because the jail was expanded or had an additional story added just after 1819. So we don't know how many cells there were, but it was certainly, it could have been as low maybe as 15, at 12, 15. We're not quite sure. The governor of the jail was Henry Moran. He assumed the governorship of the jail in the mid-1790s when Michael Moran, likely his father or possibly a brother or other relative, died or became incapacitated. And he was given, the Mayo grand jury gave him £10 per annum to enable him to engage a single turnkey or guard to assist him in ensuring that the jail was secure. It is, however, likely that there were a number of military guards in the jail as well, even before 1798, and there certainly were many of them at the jail in the period from 1800 up to its closure in 1835. The High Sheriff at the time was Dennis Brown. The local inspector of prisons was the Reverend John Ashe. And in the decades that followed 1800, Ashe and Brown fought a very lengthy legal battle where Brown sought to exclude him from jail and from his many positions in Castlebar, and he ultimately succeeded in doing that. So the Battle of Castlebar, we've already talked about, or I've already mentioned the fighting on the Green and the Mall area. I've mentioned the defence by the phrase defensible. It's likely that there were a very small number of prisoners in Castlebar jail when the French arrived. The nature of the jail was such that it was not intended that people would be kept there, prisoners would be kept there for lengthy periods of time. The maximum I think anybody would be held to would likely have been something in the region of 12 months. And it's likely that the prison population that was there was made up of debtors, vagrants, perhaps prostitutes, people who had been guilty of minor infractions, assaults, maybe even larceny. So that was the position when the jail fell to the French. French officers then moved among the prison population. They worked at selecting inmates that could be recruited to the ranks of the French-Irish army, and some did indeed join the ranks. Also, a number of prisoners who would have been captured during the Battle of Castlebar, and indeed after the battle, were imprisoned in the jail. And some of those on their capture and installation in the jail elected to also to desert, turn their coats, and joined the French-Irish contingent. And many of those who did that came from the Royal Longford Militia and the Royal Kilkenny Militia. Governor Moran is absent from the records. We don't know whether he was in the jail when it was attacked. Knowing the character of the man, I suspect not. He is likely to have fled the town, or he may have been captured. He certainly didn't do anything wrong by the English Protestant authorities, because he regained his position once the town was retaken, and continued as governor of Castlebar Jail for a very long time after that. So the French used the jail to contain prisoners of war they had taken, and officials from the administration. In the days that followed the Battle of Castlebar, the Republic of Connaught was declared. John Moore from Moorhall was appointed to the presidency of the new republic. A municipal council was established with some interesting characters serving on it, some of whom, following the collapse of the rebellion, worked hard at capturing rebels and supporting the military in bringing to justice some of those who had been involved in the rebellion with the French and the Irish. So on the 3rd of September, Humbert begins his exit from Castlebar. Rather strangely, he releases 80 prisoners from the jail, and among them there was the Reverend Thomas Ellison. And Ellison very quickly made his way out of Castlebar, rendezvoused with the English military, and played an important role in the retaking of Castlebar, which happened not long afterwards. The Castlebar is retaken. The military immediately assumed control of the jail to the exclusion of the civilian authority. Irish combatants and sympathisers are imprisoned, and then by mid-September 1798, the prison population has risen to 190, which is pretty phenomenal when you think that the capacity of the prison was 90 prisoners. And even if we assume there were 25 cells, which there weren't, we're looking at quite a number of prisoners per cell with 190, bearing in mind other considerations that would have to be taken into account around the separation of certain types of prisoners. So who were all of these people, all of these prisoners? This is a Hames picture from the 20th century, painting, and I think that it captures all of the brutality of the different methods used to capture insurgents, to extract information, and I suppose punish those who were involved in the rebellion and in the early defeats suffered by the English and the Protestant militia and yeomanry. Well, the sources for the prisoners kept at Castlebar Jail, there are many different sources. This image here is probably the best source there is, and I think it's also probably my favorite source. And I think it's also a really important document in the history of Castlebar, and it currently resides and has for a very long time resided in the National Archives in Dublin. And it's a calendar of prisoners drawn up by the Provost Marshal, William Clavrogue, on the 27th of February, 1799. That's the day I mentioned at the very outset. And there are 74 names on that list, 70 men and four women. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. This is just a list of the sources that I've had recourse to in putting together all of these names and the details. I've highlighted in red what I consider to be, the real hotspots in terms of sources. So the calendar of prisoners I've just mentioned. There are two further ones, one for Ballinrobe and one for Castlebar, but they're much smaller or shorter, and they relate to March of 1800. Prisoner petitions, and there are two series of those at the National Archives, prisoners' petitions and then the state prisoner petitions. And they are petitions submitted by those found guilty and sentenced to either transportation or death. And there are petitions to the Lord Lieutenant looking to have their sentences commuted to lesser sentences. I found a very significant number of those, several hundreds, probably even close to 1,000, for the periods from the late 1790s up to the mid 1830s. So a really good source for prisoners right through that period, and not just 1798. In fact, 1798 probably only makes up a very small percentage of the numbers of Mayo men and women as well to be found in these petitions. The rebellion papers, also at the National Archives, contain a vast quantity of material on 1798 and on Mayo, and I found the papers relating to court martials to be particularly useful, not just for names, but also for giving some colour as to how the prison was operated and what prisoners were thinking and doing and fearing at that time, and also what people like William Clavrogue, Dennis Brown, and others were doing to contain these prisoners. The source that I probably found most interesting is the New South Wales convict records, and these are online, accessible through many different providers and platforms. And the great advantage of those is that you can actually find Mayo rebels who were obviously tried, sentenced to transportation, sent to New South Wales, and no record of them exists in Castlebar or indeed anywhere in Ireland, but they appear in the New South Wales convict records, and they take you all the way back to Castlebar. So they will tell you or give you names of individuals who are tried in Castlebar courthouse on a particular day. On some occasions, it will actually tell you that they were a rebel captain, or some other explicit connection is made to 1798. So they are very interesting and very useful. And then there's a list of other ones I've put there. I think that some of them yielded very little. Surprisingly, newspapers in particular yielded very little, but they were still really worth looking at, and they did, in their own right, yield a small number of very important names and individuals. So this is an extract from the calendar of prisoners from the 27th of February 1799. And now it's really difficult to read, but if you look across the top, you'll see it shows the names of the prisoners, the dates they were committed, by who they were committed, and then some details on the crimes, sentences, and more general remarks. And if you look at the group at the very top, you'll see a group of men and women who were in the custody or in the jail since the last assizes. So that would have meant they were in jail when the French arrived. The last assizes in Castlebar would have been in July of 1798. And at that assizes, they were sentenced to, by order of the court, to spend, in some cases, 12 months in prison. So they would have remained in the jail unless they accepted a role with the ranks of the French and Irish. They would have otherwise remained in the jail until the next assizes, which would not have been for some time after the military authorities had ceded control of legal matters to the civilian courts. If you look down through the list, I think one of the ones that's quite interesting is Mary, looks like Mary Brannan or Brennan. She's number 9. She is the only woman I have found who was arrested post the rebellion. She was arrested I think on the 18th of October for general criminality, it would seem, for I think it's for robbery. And then others on the list include a number of individuals taken by Dennis Bingham for felony. And it's not clear whether those felonies were connected to the rebellion or not. But I think it's probably worth pointing out that during this period, it would be a mistake to assume that the jail only held those who were involved in the rebellion. A lot of people, mostly men, were also detained for general crimes, some quite serious crimes, rape, robbery, sheep stealing, etc. And they found themselves incarcerated with those who had been taken for the rebellion, and found themselves in the jail, mostly under the control of the military. So just looking briefly at the classes of prisoners that I've identified in the period 1798 to 1801. So as I mentioned, there are 228 prisoners on the list, coming from a whole variety of sources, in some cases from the work of others, people like Richard Hayes, Desmond McCabe, in some cases from the archives, newspapers, etc. 74 of the 228 come from the list from the 27th of February of 1799, and 16 come from the later list from March 1800. As I've already mentioned, in the jail in the period, there were a small number of pre-1798 prisoners. There were also a good number of post-1798 ordinary rank and file criminals who were not involved in the rebellion. The records reveal a good number of rebel captains, and I've detailed all of them in my study Anatomy of a County Jail, as well as rank and file rebels, deserters from the different militias, political prisoners, people like John Moore, escapees. So they fall into, I suppose, two different categories: those who joined the French and took part in the rebellion and were subsequently recaptured, put back into jail, albeit now under the control of the military rather than civilian authority, and those who managed to escape while the prison or the jail was under the control of the English military, and who were again recaptured. Prisoners at the jail across all the classes fell into two categories: those on remand, so in the civilian context, those awaiting trial at the assizes, and in the military context, those awaiting military court-martial. Those who had been tried and convicted were either fell into, if they hadn't been acquitted, which believe it or not did happen, fell into categories of transport convicts who awaited a military detachment to take them across Ireland to one of the exit points, or those sentenced to death awaiting execution of their sentence a few meters from the jail, or perhaps in some cases they were taken to other towns like Newport, Westport, Claremorris and Ballina, where they were hanged there. So of the many hangings that did take place in Mayo as a consequence of the events of 1798, I have managed to link 36 of those with the jail on the Green in Castlebar, some absolutely with a high degree of certainty, some less certain, and I've made that distinction in the book. Where I've been unclear about it, I think there is scope for further research in the future. So what was the atmosphere and conditions like in the jail on the Green in the immediate aftermath of the rebellion? Well, as I mentioned, the prison was split. Most of it was commandeered by the military, and I believe the Royal Meath Militia played a significant role in terms of the containment of prisoners. That part of the prison that was under the control of the military was under the control of Provost Marshal William Clavrogue. Very little detail or information on Clavrogue. His name appears at the end of a number of the calendars of prisoners, and he features in a lengthy ballad or poem published in the 1840s that outlines a role he played along with Governor Moran in the hunt for James Joseph MacDonald of Carnacon House in Mayo. The distinction between the civilian and military part of the jail was used to great effect by Dennis Brown at Castlebar Courthouse when a habeas corpus application was made by the doctor at the jail seeking to have John Moore released from the jail on grounds of ill health. Dennis Brown was able to say that the application made to court to order him to release Moore was of no effect, because even though he was High Sheriff, and even though he was the person responsible in Mayo for the jail, Moore was not within his jurisdiction, because the part of the jail that Moore was residing in was under the control of William Claverack and the military. I've already touched on the issue of overcrowding. In mid-September into October, November 1798, numbers would have been very high. By February of the following year, they had dropped down to below the 90 persons capacity limit. The jail would have been dark. There would have been, during the day, I mean, obviously there would have been light through the windows from outside, but at night, it's difficult to imagine the military were handing out candles in the cells, so the cells would have been very dark. The legal requirements as to classification imposed by prison legislation would have been suspended, so the civilian classification under the legislation required that the prisoners be separated based on sex, age, seriousness of crime, and all of that. That is obviously unlikely to have applied, and instead the military probably more likely applied a classification based on the nature of the prisoners. So it is likely that prisoners who had deserted from the militias were probably kept separate from rank and file Irish rebels. It's likely that political prisoners like John Moore were kept separate, and there is evidence that he was kept closely confined and under guard. There was no running water in the prison at the time. Prisoners were kept in chains, though it would seem not chained to walls. They were in leg irons and arm irons. As I've already mentioned, the prison rules are suspended. And overall, I suspect that the atmosphere in the jail was one of desperation and fear. And particularly for those who were awaiting a court-martial or who had been sentenced to death, listening to the sounds of people being hanged, a few yards away, just beyond the walls. There's lots of evidence of prisoners plotting escapes, working on their stories, trying to reconcile what they had done in the days during the rebellion and in the days leading up to their capture, so that they could present a coherent story at their court-martial and in some way try and present the cards, I suppose, they've been dealt with, to their advantage. Others worked on preparing for their trials, and there is some evidence that lawyers were admitted and allowed to assist. So prisoner profiles, just to look at some of those who were confined in the jail. This image here is will be familiar to anybody who's really had a look at 1798. This is a version of the proclaimed rebels list that was published by Major General Trench, and many of the names on the list will be familiar to you. I deal with each of them in the book to the extent that their fate was known, and quite a number of them were held at Castlebar, and a good number of them were executed on the green at Castlebar, or were taken from Castlebar jail to Newport or Claremorris or elsewhere for execution. So just looking at, I've picked these profiles. I've tried to stay away for the most part from people who are well known, and I've looked at the ones I've chosen for the most part to, I suppose, illustrate different points. And I suppose the first one is Michael Newman, a deserter from the Longford militia. So he was captured at Castlebar by the French. He was imprisoned in Castlebar jail, and he was court-martialed in 1799. And his court-martial records they're really excellent because they show a number of things. They show the anguish in his mind in terms of how he was going to, first of all, the thought process he went through before he turned his coat and deserted, and then secondly, how that detail was used in his trial. At his trial, Sergeant Wilson gave evidence I think, against him, but in reality, the evidence that was given helped him quite a lot. Newman told Wilson that he believed that he had no choice but to join the French. He was a Catholic and felt that if he did not join the French, he would have been killed. That seems unlikely. He also believed that he would get a higher rank if he joined the ranks of the French, and this might have been because he's seen others achieving higher rank. And then he also believed that if it all went wrong and the rebellion collapsed, sure, he could always surrender to the yeomanry and everything would be fine. So we had a lengthy discussion about all of this with Sergeant Wilson, and he departed, and later he was seen from the windows of the jail parading around the green in Castlebar with his coat turned inside out, a sign that he had in fact deserted. So he was court-martialed, he was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted. And I think the reason it was commuted was because of the manner in which the facts in the story was spun by himself and by the witnesses, that really he was someone who was left with no choice, and really his heart lay with the militia and not with the French invaders and their Irish supporters. Thomas Rigney was in a kind of a similar situation. Rigney was one of the men listed on the rebel list proclaimed by Trench, and one of the charges against him was that he took arms from Protestants. He was captured in June 1799 and spent 15 months at Castlebar jail for his court-martial in October 1800. His court-martial is really interesting because William Claveraug, Provost Marshal of the jail, gave evidence, and in that evidence, Claveraug explained that Rigney shared a cell with 4 others, that the 4 approached Rigney to help them develop a plot to escape. He declined the offer, and on the first available moment, he sought out the military authorities, betrayed the plot, and in Claveraug's view, had Rigney not betrayed the plot, several soldiers in the jail could have been killed. Rigney was aboard the Atlas II heading to New South Wales in 1802 and arrived in Sydney in October of that year. His wife walked from Castlebar to Dublin with her children, depositing them at different locations along the way, hoping to convince the authorities in Dublin to release her husband, but she was unsuccessful. So John Maguire. Maguire was a rebel leader. Very little in the records about Maguire. Most of what we have about him comes from oral history, folklore, tradition, that sort of thing. So he was charged with carrying arms and being a rebel leader. He was part of a group of men who attempted to make an escape from the jail by digging a hole or burying a hole in the wall. They managed to succeed in breaking or breaching the wall, and for whatever reason that they felt they had no more time, they were forced to make their way through the gap. They took off their clothes because it was very narrow. They were still in their chains. Unfortunately for Maguire, his frame was too large, so he got stuck and could not get out, and he was sentenced to death and hanged. There are a lot of stories around groups seeking to dig their way out of the jail through the walls. I suspect there probably was one event, and it's been corrupted through the retelling. I believe that there's a strong possibility that Peter Gibbons and a gentleman called Captain Gohan were part of the John Maguire attempt. Captain Richard Jordan attempted an escape of a different kind. We'll get onto that in a couple of moments. John Moore, the short-lived president of Connacht, was detained on the 6th of November 1798. The War Office wanted him to stand trial for rebellion. Civil authorities and the military authorities fought legal battles over the jurisdiction to try more. He's on the list on the 27th of February 1799. We know he was kept in close confinement and subject to abuse and mistreatment by the military. I've already mentioned the habeas corpus application that failed, and ultimately Moore submitted to exile abroad and died in questionable circumstances in Waterford towards the end of 1799. Kemlin, we don't have his first name. He was in the King's Lifeguards, deserted and joined the French as a captain. He was captured in a shootout near Gaol by the Turla Yeomanry. Again, little in terms of official detail around this gentleman. He was holed up in a house with two others near Gaol, surrounded by the yeomanry. They attacked the house. The door was kicked in, and Kemlin discharged his musket into the head of a young man named Clark, who died. Kemlin was taken to Castlebar. And again, there are different accounts, but the probably most reliable or consistent account is that he was court-martialed and hanged on the same day on the green in Castlebar. His body was left to hang as a deterrent to others. And the story of Kemlin's demise and the hanging of his remains in Castlebar is retold or recounted in the first chapter of William Hamilton Maxwell's novel, The Adventures of Captain Blake, or My Life as it's called. And that's makes an interesting, if not strange and bizarre read. Richard Merrick bore arms in the charge was he bore arms in the late unnatural rebellion. He had some considerable difficulty reconciling his position. The evidence against him was very strong. He was found in possession of arms belonging to the Prince of Wales Regiment. He was found in possession of boots belonging to Thomas Fitzgerald of Turla House. He was seen with the French. He was seen with a French musket. And he was court-martialed, one of the earlier court-martials in October 1798, found guilty and sentenced to transportation for life. He relied on defense of duress, claimed that Captain Gohan, that I've already mentioned, and some others forced him into joining the ranks of the rebellion. And somewhat surprisingly, given the evidence, etc., he was not sentenced to death and was transported. Michael McKeel, rebel captain. McKeel is an example of somebody who was involved in the rebellion, but also got up to other stuff as well. He was committed to Castlebar Jail in December 1798. The charge against him was that of being a rebel captain, but also that he was involved in rape and robbery. And there were quite a number of individuals that rape charges were brought against, and also charges of robbery, assault, and other matters that perhaps arose out of the rebellion, but were not obviously part of the military effort on the Irish and French side. So he was court-martialed in April 1799 and hanged. John McPeak is an interesting one because he's an example of somebody that I've been unable to find any evidence of in Ireland, but he appears in the records in New South Wales. So the 28-year-old was a United Irishman, court-martialed in Castlebar, transported, arriving in New South Wales in February 1801, sent to the terrible penal colony at Norfolk Island, and then dies in 1825. And with all of these individuals who made their way to New South Wales, there are a series of documents. There are pardons, there are letters of leave, there are other commercial documents where you can see them establishing businesses in New South Wales, being involved in public life, in politics, etc. So it all makes for a very interesting reading. Just a few words on female prisoners. There were very few of them, very few in the jail. I mentioned the few that were in prison when the French arrived, and they were serving time for offences unconnected with the rebellion. I've also mentioned Mary Brennan. But if there were not many women in the jail for reasons connected with the rebellion or otherwise, they would seem to have played an important role in many of the escapes. So we see Captain Richard Jordan sentenced to death, suffering from fever. His sentence is delayed. His niece Jane Taff appears at the jail either with a dress or she swapped her dress for his clothing. I'm not sure which, but he walks out of the prison wearing a dress and is immediately apprehended by the military. Later taken to Claremorris, where he's hanged. Larry Gillespie, not sure if Larry Gillespie was in Castlebar jail, but Larry Gillespie's story is kind of amusing in the circumstances. He was court-martialed in Ballina, detained in jail. His wife turns up with a bottle of poutine, bribes the guard. That may seem surprising, but there are many stories, not just during the rebellion, but in the decades that follow, of military guards at Castlebar jail assisting with escapes in return for a few coins or whiskey or something else. So it wasn't all that surprising. So she gets into the prison. He swaps her clothes with Gillespie, and he leaves the prison dressed as a woman. Following day, she's brought before Lord Portarlington, Ormsby, and others. And ultimately, and I suppose fortunately for her, she gets released. Gillespie heads into the Nathan Mountains and disappears. Turns up many years later to find that Mrs. Gillespie is no longer Mrs. Gillespie. She has remarried, and clearly she was willing to put her life on the line to help him escape from the jail, but she certainly wasn't willing to wait around too long for him. There's also a suggestion in some of the oral histories that Peter Gibbons escaped from the jail, not through a hole in the wall, but by wearing a woman's dress. Again, it's really difficult to know what the truth in all of that is. But just a brief mention of some of the others. Father James Conroy, patriot priest, lots written about him, sentenced to death for treason, hanged on the green in Castlebar, lots of commemorations to Father Conroy around. Thomas Donlan I've included here simply because he's the only case I found where there's a very specific, I suppose, military engagement put opposite his name. So he was charged with disarming a soldier. So obviously he was involved in hand-to-hand combat of some form. Frederick Ferris, Miles Burke, and Pat Egan, all sentenced to transportation, all in Castlebar jail on the 27th of February. And all of them were sick, not sure what illness they were suffering from, but there was an absolute bar on taking prisoners who were ill into the ranks of those being transported on the convict ships. For obvious reasons, they didn't want the illnesses to get into the ships, so they were kept back at Castlebar until they recovered. Claude Duke in jail for jail breaking, so assuming that he broke jail, was arrested and was back in jail. John and George Duke were liberated by the French when they arrived Castlebar, recaptured and back in jail in February 1799. Pat Hines and Aeneas Grogan, I find these two characters quite interesting. In the middle of a war, they're out sheep stealing, which was obviously quite a common thing to be doing in Mayo, and I just wonder how they felt when they found themselves amongst all of these rebels and prisoners in Castlebar jail in the spring of 1799. Pat Barrett is also on the February 1799 list. I don't know if that's the same Pat Barrett as the Pat Barrett hanged in, as the Dr. Pat Barrett hanged in Ballina sometime afterwards. It's likely that it was, but we can't be sure. The various lists, and in particular the February 1799 list, is very useful because it gives you some quite significant detail on the numbers who were are the individuals who are heavily involved in hunting down and capturing rebels and conveying them back to Castlebar jail. Top of the league was William Kirkwood, but others who were very active include the Reverend Thomas Ellison of Castlebar, Dennis Brown, obviously, and John Gardner. So some conclusions. Well, the rebellion in Mayo did not end with the defeats at Ballinammuck and Killala. Court-martials, hangings, transportations continued for several years, and there are trials and executions and transportations right up to 1806 and perhaps some afterwards. Castlebar Jail played a really pivotal role in the effort to put down the insurrection and punish those involved. The Battle of Castlebar, as I mentioned before, it's been long celebrated and rightly so. But I do believe that the jail needs to be included in the narrative in a way that it hasn't hitherto been included. The jail itself is obviously a long time gone. It was demolished in the 19th century. But we have the names of so many of the 1798 men, and these should not be forgotten and they should be remembered. And we cannot discount the possibility that some of them were buried in the jail yard behind the jail on the green. The full details of all of these men, that's the ones I have found, my sources, the reasons why I believe the jail in Castlebar played an important role in putting down the rebellion are all set out in Nassau County Jail, and there are copies of it available through all the online platforms, notwithstanding that we are still in a series of lockdown. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up the link to questions. If you want to ask a question, then you need to raise your hand. Then I will select you and unmute you. And when your question has been answered, to the extent I can answer it, then please can I ask you to mute yourself so that we don't get feedback that interferes with others. If I don't get to your question or I'm unable to answer a question, then I'm more than happy to engage with you on the email or through Messenger or indeed on the Facebook page after the event. So it'll take me a couple of seconds just to get this going. Okay. So Jarlath Cunningham, I think you've got your hand raised. So do you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. This is really interesting, thanks, Mia. What was Castlebar like, though, outside of the prison? What was going on around, or were they aware of what was going on around the general public about what was going on in the prison that was there at the time?
I think that there would have been a very high degree of awareness about what the prison was, who was in the prison, what you needed to do to get into the prison, what you needed to do to get out of the prison. There are records of a prison in Castlebar going right back through the 18th century, and more recently I've actually found a reference to a prison in Castlebar in the 1670s, which is in itself a very interesting thing. So there would have been a high degree of awareness of what the prison was all about. During the week following the success at Castlebar, there would have been a lot of military men in the town. There would have been a considerable amount of activity. You would have had military parading. You would have had celebrating. There were at least 2 balls that I'm aware of in the town. The taverns would have been very busy. I think there would have been a feeling of elation and celebration. But I think if you were to look to the military planners and the strategists and ask them what their view was. I think that what they were saying publicly probably differed quite a lot from what they thought, and I would imagine that they probably felt quite isolated. And we see Humbert packing up and leaving, on the 3rd of September. So, Jonathan, this was an answer to your question. I think it would have been an extremely busy place, an extremely active place. But I was looking in a separate context at the Charter School for Girls, which lay on the outskirts of Castlebar. Such was the concern within that establishment. I think there were some 50 girls kept there. Such was the concern within that establishment about what was happening in the town, the degree of unlawfulness that was taking place. They managed to, or they had to, board up all the lower level windows to protect the people inside from those on the streets who were causing trouble and who could have broken into the school and done terrible things to the occupants. Anything else, Jonathan?
No, that's good. Yeah, I was just curious about what was going on. Castlebar, the gossip that might have gone on at the time, or anything like that. Or
well, there was a lot of gossip. There's no doubt about it. And I think if you read, there's so many great sources. Then if you're looking for real gossip on it, then one of the sources that I really like, and I've been reading it again in recent days, is that in early 1800, the Reverend Benton from the South Mayo militia a public inquiry took place because he suggested that James O'Donnell from Newport House had a foot in both camps and was by day capturing rebels and by night letting them go. And his trial, the papers run to some 200 pages. And from that, it's quite a gossipy trial. And you get some really good insights on what they found in people's houses when they broke into them, the green ribbons, the green hats hidden in the houses of Protestants, what songs were being sung, what songs were not sung, who was telling people not to sing songs, all of that kind of stuff. There's also a collection of letters which I've worked through recently, written by a lady called Jane Fraser, whose father was Major Fraser, who was one of the senior military commanders in Castlebar during all of this. And she was resident in an officer's house in Westport. And she was busy writing letters and putting military stamps on them. Those letters were making their way across the Irish Sea, and many of them have survived. I think 19 have survived for Castlebar and Westport. And her letters are absolutely fantastic. And if you've watched things like Pride and Prejudice or those types of things, her letters are divided into three, I suppose, sections. The first section is, what's Daddy doing? Section 2 is what's happening in the countryside. And section 3 is all about all the fit men who are hanging around the barracks. What are the possibilities with these fit men? How much were they worth a year? What money they had? Their looks, their appearances, etc., etc. So a huge amount of gossip if you want to go looking for it.
I'll tell you, it was good to see so many Westport fellas in the jail as well. Maybe that's where our rivalry comes from.
Very good.
Thanks very much.
Okay, Ollie Weiss, I'm seeing your name here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Oliver, go ahead.
All right, well, thanks very much for another great talk. Very well presented and with great content in it. And it's given us great insight into what was going on in Mayo at the time. But how about the landlords around the place, like Dukans and Binghams and Browns and all that? What was their attitude to all this?
Well, I think for the most part, they didn't receive the news of the rebellion all that well. Some of them became extremely active in the action against the rebels. People like William Kirkwood, the O'Donnells of Newport, the Browns of Westport, obviously, and also Dennis Brown, Dennis Bingham in Belmullet in Erris, all took a very active role. So they were on horseback, they were on the roads, in the fields, hunting down rebels. Mr. Jackson in Ennisco was busy hanging people. So a very active role. Dennis Brown in particular was very active with the military. He was High Sheriff at the time, so he would have played an important role in the court martials. In fairness to Mr. Moore of Moore Hall, John Moore, he obviously made a huge mistake, and perhaps, you know, looking at it from one perspective, took the side of right, but from his own perspective, it was not the side to be on, and you know, he paid the ultimate price for that. Some of those whose loyalties were probably less well defined afterwards had questions to answer in terms of their lack of perceived lack of action, or being quiet at the time. And it's funny when you look at one of the things that I'm hoping to publish, you know, very soon is an account of something that happened much later, some years later, that involved Dennis Bingham in Alvarez. And in that context, it's clear that, you know, for at least 2 or 3 decades after 1798, those in the gentry or the landed class who played an active role in the suppression of the rebellion, they traded on the reputation of that in the eyes of Dublin Castle, and they used it against their peers in Mayo when it came to all manner of disputes. You know, it was quite common to say, well, you know, I was there in 1798, you know, which bed were you hiding under? And in the 1830s, you know, one of my favourite characters in Castlebar, Frederick Cavendish, accused Major Owen O'Malley of Spencer Park of shooting a deaf man during 1798. That resulted in a libel case in the Court of the King's Bench in Dublin, and some great fun as well. So I think in all, to answer your question, as was in the round, the landed class of gentry, you know, a lot of them lost a lot. They lost a lot of damage to their houses. Some of them lost their houses. They lost their property. Their wine was drunk. The beef was distributed amongst the French. So, you know, financially they lost out, and they spent quite a bit of time afterwards seeking recompense for that.
Just one other quick one. Was there any medical attention to all these people who have been hung and imprisoned and all this kind of stuff? Any record of medical activity involved around all this stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, there was under law, under statute, there was a doctor at Castlebar prison. I've put his name into the book, and I think around 1798, 99, 1800, there were actually 2 of them, and you know, certainly any accounts of those that I've come across show that they were good men. They might not have believed in the rebel cause. They might have been Orangemen. They might have been, you know, singing the Orange songs. But when it came to the wounded man, they did the right thing. And we see that in the case of Dennis Brown, where the doctor actually made a habeas corpus application to the court to have him released because he really did feel that his life was in danger. But you know, if people are making decisions around prisoners being sick and not available for transportation, then I'm sure the doctors were making that decision. There were also doctors present at the executions. You know, quite what they did is unclear. Certainly they would have pronounced death afterwards and been involved in conveying the bodies to the infirmary for dissection, where that was ordered.
Thank you.
Okay, so who have we got? So we've got Mary Arico, is that it? Mary, can you hear me?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, Mary, go ahead.
Oh, hello. Well, I was just rather interested in that first picture that came up, because there seemed to be about 3 black soldiers amongst the English military. And I wondered if any work had been done on that, where they would have been recruited from, and also what impact that would have had, you know, within the town.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we've got the National Library of Ireland to thank for the dark coloured soldiers in that image.
Is it just, are they really, or is it just the picture?
I think it's just a picture. I did try to do some work on it, but they actually look worse than they did in pictures. So I think that that picture is not evidence that there were black soldiers in the English military, but there definitely were amongst the ranks of the French. And
Right.
there are some accounts. There's the McLaughlin account, which was posted on the history page maybe a week ago. And so there's some evidence there. There's also some evidence in a really terrible piece written by William Hamilton Maxwell in his fictitious Adventures of Captain Blake. And it's likely to be something that will probably be banned if more people read it, but it is available on the internet. And the first chapter of that is a fictionalized account of the capture of Kemlin, his transit to Castlebar, and probably not going to repeat some of the stuff that's in it, but in Maxwell's commentary, he explains how Kemlin was hanged by Dennis Brown's Negro, a man by the name of Sambo. So you can kind of work out where that goes.
Yeah.
And that came from somewhere. And if you look at other sources more generally, you do get references to people of colour in Castlebar, but more so in Westport. And there's a very specific reason for that. And I hope when, perhaps in June, when I publish my paper on the connections between County Mayo and slave plantations of Caribbean, that connection will perhaps become more, what it's all about will become more obvious. I don't really want to burden tonight with it. But the answer to your question, were there black soldiers in the regiments that came into Mayo? I don't know. I've seen no evidence of it. Certainly, when you get into the 1820s and 1830s, there were black regiments, the West Indies Regiment, in the British Army, in the Caribbean, and there were undoubtedly black soldiers in the French military.
Thanks very much, Michael.
Do we have any more questions? Elaine Fitzgerald, I think I'm seeing you. Can you hear me, Elaine?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Hello.
Hello, how you doing? It's not directly related to the talk, which was wonderful, thank you very much. But I'm a local primary school teacher in Castlebar, and I'm just wondering if you give any talks, whether through Zoom or different, that kind of thing, for children about the history of Castlebar and the races of Castlebar especially.
More than happy to do it. Just send me a message afterwards and we can set something up.
Great, it'd be great. Something that I do try to talk about and to encourage as much as possible, because I just think it's fascinating and good to get them interested in local history. So anything that would benefit that would be great. So I definitely will be in contact. Thank you.
Very good. Looking forward to it. Seamus Birmingham. Hello, Seamus.
Michael, how are you doing? I was interested in from your book, actually, Daniel Sheridan, a rebel captain.
Right.
He was in the jail there like that. And I saw another report somewhere that I got that he was sent for penal servitude.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I saw like. And the reason I was following him, because doing the family history on my wife's family, her great-great-great-grandfather was a Daniel Sheridan. Whether there be anything the same or not, but they came from Foxford. So is there any more information on these rebels that were arrested or have anything on them as such?
I think that what I've done, what I've tried to do, and with much of what I do, I try to bring out the bits that might be relevant to genealogists, because it's something I am interested in myself. I think with Daniel, he's not in my mind as we speak. I mean, there are a lot of individuals, but if I had an address for Daniel, I would definitely have put it in the book, in the schedule. Or if I had any other kind of very personal detail around an age or a profession or anything like that. So chances are, Seamus Birmingham, that there is nothing else. But what I will do is I will look at my notes and just see if there's anything that I may have missed about Daniel. Daniel is, a reasonably unusual name. Sheridan is not all that common. So, you sort of start at a position where you're kind of thinking that, there is a possibility he may have been involved.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Michael.
Brian Kelly, I'm just going to unmute you. Hello, Brian. Hello, Brian. Okay, we'll move on to Thomas O'Kellick. Oh, hang on, Brian.
Yeah, I just muted. I had to allow. Sorry. Thank you for the talk. I guess what I'm interested in is where can I find more?
Well, I'll be really cheeky and say you can start by getting the book.
Yeah, in this,
and
I'm not sure the title and stuff, which book. I mean,
okay, well, what I'll do is, are you in the history group, Brian?
no.
Okay, well.
I'm just in that Facebook group.
Sorry, in the history group on Facebook, the County Mayo History and Heritage page?
No, just the, I think it's a genealogy type thing.
Oh, okay. Well, look, Brian, the book is called Anatomy of a County Jail, a history of imprisonment, capital punishment and transportation in County Mayo. And it's the best place to get it at the moment with lockdown is probably through either the mayo.ie website, which is probably the best and most economical way of getting it. But it's also available through other bookshops and also available through Amazon. And in the book, I have referenced thousands of sources for individuals and other facts. And the schedule of sources runs to, I don't know how many pages, but there's a lot in there on all of the individuals. So it will enable you to read what's in the book about particular people you're looking at, and then hopefully it will open a door to a much greater body of material, an original material that you can pursue yourself.
Yeah, definitely. Just one other thing. So it's basically on the prison stuff. Is there a lot of looking for information too at that time period of what was happening? Where my genealogy suffers from Claremorris mostly. So looking for any type of history in this time period.
Yeah, look,
I don't know if there's any.
It really does depend. If you're looking at public institutions, so if you're looking at prisons, so I'm taking that you mean late 18th century into the 19th century. If you're looking at public institutions and you know where the archives are, then there is a considerable amount of information, particularly in the National Archives in Dublin. I've just completed a review over the last 2 weeks of all of the military correspondence between Dublin Castle and individual soldiers who've returned alive from campaigns with the British military. And it took me a considerable amount of time, but what I've taken away from that is there was a lot of letter writing, and a lot of the letters have survived. And a lot of the letters are the kind of begging letters. So they're fantastic for genealogy because they paint desperate personal circumstances. They talk about family members, that kind of thing. So if you work your way through the military, the public institutions, issues around disturbances, ribbonmen, white boys, issues around starvation, particularly the early 1820s, early 1830s, a lot of correspondence in Dublin Castle. The other place where I find really good is the newspaper archives, not so much for the first decade of the 19th century, particularly after the rebellion. The newspapers seem to have closed down, been suppressed, disappeared, whatever. There's very, very little in terms of social history Hello, so. Hi, Elaine, can you, okay, thanks. So the answer is yes, there is a lot of material, a lot of documentation in the archives if you know where to go looking. And a lot of it I've highlighted in the schedules to the book, the prisons book. And
Okay.
a lot more I'll be releasing between now and July, particularly around military men from Mayo who served in the British Army, and also around the extensive connections between Mayo and the Caribbean, Sri Lanka, as is now known, and India as well. That's probably all I can say at it now, but happy to take it offline and have a more fulsome discussion about it if I can help you in any other way, Brian.
You know, you said you did paper, you were going to release a paper or something opposed to a book, right?
It's a series of papers. There's about 25 of them, and they're currently going through a design phase, and they will be published as a book, subject to getting through lockdown and stuff like that.
Right.
I'm really hoping they will be out by the summer, but they do look at a whole range of topics, and the focus is very much on people, people and social history, and very much on ordinary people. So I'm hoping that will contribute to the knowledge database and help people like yourself with research in Mayo.
Great, thank you very much.
Do we have anybody else for one last question, maybe? I'm not seeing anybody on the list. Oh, hang on, Thomas Malone. Thomas, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can indeed, Thomas.
How you doing, Michael?
Good to hear from you.
Good seeing you. I just wondering if you know, as a frequent visitor to Ireland and to Mayo, of course, I was wondering, has there been any more effort by the Mayo County Council to do more about featuring the events around the 1798 rebellion and Castlebar's role in it? In Castlebar, I know we had a little discussion online in the History and Heritage Facebook page about the hotel and it being renovated, etc. So, you know, I could see a whole interpretive museum, as well as diorama, video, what have you, being set up as a centerpiece for potentially drawing visitors who, many American visitors, Irish American visitors, probably do not have a lot of information or background on the 1798 rebellion. And, you know, one of the many places where if certain things happened, Ireland would have become independent country much earlier. So I was just wondering if the county council is beginning to see the potential for, once pandemic is over, drawing tourists and visitors to Castlebar.
So if it's an independent country or some sort of vassal state within the French Empire, not entirely clear which, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Mayo County Council have done an absolutely fantastic job in promoting 1798. There was a reenactment a number of years ago, not so long ago, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful spectacle. There's a lot of details and fantastic photographs on, I think, the mayo.ie webpage. So Mayo County Council have always been really great at getting behind to promote Castlebar. It's not their job to write books. It's not their job to go into the archives and dig out the stories. That's the work of people like me who love doing it. But certainly I have always found that they've been incredibly supportive. Castlebar Library is a wonderful, wonderful resource. The museum in Turla, again, wonderful people there, and all the way to Dublin. So the support is all there. The most specific question you have, issue you have around an interpretive centre or museum in Castlebar, it is my view, and I think it would be the view of many, that the history of Castlebar as a place and its role in the history of Mayo and its role in the history of Ireland deserves its own space. It deserves a place where we can showcase the 1798 rebellion, the disturbances of ribbon men and white boys, threshers, the early decades of the 1800s. It's a place where we can, show what it was like from a pure social history perspective to live in Castlebar, what people wore, how they spoke, what they did to make a living. There's a wonderful story in Castlebar around the growth of the development of the free press in Ireland that nobody talks about. And again, there could be something there around that. Where does all that stuff go if we do have a museum or an interpretive centre? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, people talk about this, the hotel on the green, and I think that the key principle I think that needs to be established up front is, do we need the thing? I believe we do. Others may have different views. When we decide or when we agree we need the thing, the question then is, where does it belong? I personally think it should be in the town. It would be lovely to have it in the older quarter of the town, Ellison Street, the Green, that area. Would the hotel be appropriate? I don't know. I mean, I think that's something that really would require a proper survey to be done. And there would be other places as well that might be equally good in terms of appropriate use of space, appropriate return on space for the stakeholders, and appropriate, target for spend of money. And I think we can all, and I'm probably as guilty as anyone of standing on the soapbox and demanding that we have things, but we are in the midst of something utterly terrible. And I think that there's going to have to be a reconciling and a rejigging of priorities. And I think those of us who are interested in history and heritage have a long battle ahead to make sure that we try and keep as much of it alive in the minds of everyone who is suffering right now, so that when things do turn, that we can try and stake a bigger claim in the rankings and the pecking order when it comes to spend on things like that. So I'm not sure if that answers all of your question, Tom, but that's my thoughts on it anyway.
Well, I just see Castlebar having the potential of drawing more people to the town to learn more about the history of Castlebar and 1798 rebellion, what have you. And I understand the trade-off is the increase of traffic and all these Americans asking dumb questions, but I've seen what a difference it can make here in my own hometown of Lowell, Massachusetts, where it was considered a dying mill town when I was growing up, and everyone wanted to leave. And Lowell had a very poor self-image until somebody from outside said, hey, let's celebrate the history and culture of the city. And hence a Lowell National Historic Park was developed. And it really changed the whole picture of the locals, how they viewed their own city, but also it ended up drawing people from outside to invest in the city and to invest in the assets that are here. So I just thought, again, I understand with the pandemic, a lot of things are being put on the back burner, but I see it And I know you'll agree that Castlebar has some great potential.
For sure. I'm going to try and allow one final question from Carmel McVeigh. Carmel, can you hear me? Hello, Carmel.
Can you hear me, Michael?
I can now. Go ahead.
Ah, great. Sorry, I missed some of the start of your talk. I've had some internet problems, but you mentioned the New South Wales records. Australia has very good convict records. And I'm just wondering, the records that are there, detailing Mayo convicts, I'm wondering if, for the purposes of genealogy and so forth, and people who are interested, whether anybody, do you know if anybody's put together some sort of comprehensive listing of convicts who were from Mayo?
There's an absolutely, oh, sorry. I had an answer to your question until you just add that little bit at the end from Mayo. There is there's a fantastic book written called Unfinished Rebellion by, her name is just fallen out of my head, but it's mentioned in my book, and I will post the details on the history page later on. She does pick up a lot of those who came across from Ireland early, and she does have some Mayo people as well. I have found some that are not in her book on my journeys to the records, but I think they would be an essential part of the search for Mayo ancestors. If you have an ancestor who, if you are currently in Australia, New Zealand, and you have a line of ancestry going back into the 19th century, then checking those records would be, I think, essential. But I also think that if you are looking for family in Ireland, and you're looking at family around the time of 1798, and you know there was, or you heard stories of involvement in 1798, then I think that it would be worth pursuing or following through the records, the convict records, to see if they're there as well.
Great. Okay, thank you.
One of the things I was hoping to do and might do in the autumn is to have some sort of a jail genealogy webinar type thing where we would have a panel and we could sort of draw out some of these things, if that's of interest to anybody. But
yeah,
we can
that'd be great.
Talk about that over the summer. I think Zoom is about to call time on us. We've got about 30 seconds left. So I'm going to finish by thanking everyone sincerely for coming along this evening, for listening. That makes it all very worthwhile, for asking some really good questions. And if there are, I noticed there are 2 or 3 questions in the chat that I haven't got to. One relates to numbers killed at Killala, and I do have some thoughts on those. They're mostly the thoughts of other people like Richard Hayes and Desmond McKay, but I'm happy to share them with you offline, or indeed more generally on the Mayo Facebook page, Mayo History and Heritage. And perhaps what I'll do over the weekend is actually I'll just put up those numbers so people can see them, and the sources for them as well, because they are part of I suppose the contentious history that we have around that period. So thanks very much to everyone, and good night all.